She hadn't been to the Corral in 14 months, not since the morning they carried her husband out of the house on a stretcher, and the old bay horse pressed his nose against the fence post and made a sound she had never heard a horse make before, low, searching, like a question with no answer. That morning she told herself she would never go back, but on a Tuesday in early November, something changed. Before I tell you what she found when she finally walked back through that gate, I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched an animal grieve? Not a pet acting confused, not a dog waiting by the door. I mean real grief, the kind that looks so human it makes you step back and reconsider everything you thought you understood about what creatures feel. Because what happened in that corral on that November morning wasn't something anyone expected. And I promise you, by the time this story ends, you're going to be thinking about it for days. If you've ever loved someone and then had to watch everything they touched go quiet, this one's for you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from, and then stay close, because this story starts with a woman who thought she was just going back to feed a horse. She had no idea she was about to be the one who got fed. Her name was Leonora Voss, 71 years old, born in Odessa, Texas, raised on the kind of flat, sun-scorched land where the sky takes up more of the view than the earth does, and where people learn early that silence isn't emptiness, it's just the land thinking. She had married Everett Voss 44 years ago in a church that no longer stands, in a town that barely does either. The wedding was small. 12 people, a borrowed dress, a minister who sweated through his collar before the vows were even finished. But the marriage was enormous, the kind that fills every room of a life and still has space left over. Everett was a rancher, not a wealthy one, not the kind you see in movies with helicopters and white fences that never need painting. He was the other kind, the kind who wakes at 4:30 because the animals need him, who eats his lunch standing up beside the water trough, who comes inside at dusk with mud on his knees and grease on his forearms, and somehow still finds the energy to ask Leonora about her day like it's the most important question in the world. They had a modest spread about 9 miles outside of a small town in the Texas Hill Country, 70-some acres, a few cattle, chickens that came and went with the seasons, and one horse. His name was Kappa. Kappa was a bay quarter horse, 15 hands high, with a blaze on his face shaped vaguely like a river and 3 white socks that always looked like he'd been walking through fresh paint. Everett had bought him as a 4-year-old from a man named Aldous over in Kerrville, who said the horse was too smart for his own good. Everett laughed at that. He said smart was exactly what he wanted. That was 11 years before Everett died. The two of them, Everett and Kappa, had developed the kind of relationship that people who don't spend time around horses don't quite believe is possible. Not tricks, not performance, just understanding. Kappa knew Everett's truck by sound from half a mile away. He'd begin moving toward the gate before the vehicle was even visible. Everett could change Kappa's whole mood with a particular whistle, 2 notes, low-high, that meant, "I'm here, you're fine, we're all right." Leonora watched this relationship for years, with a mixture of amusement and something she never quite named, something close to reverence. She wasn't a horse person herself. She respected them, she appreciated them, but she didn't have what Everett had, the ease, the language. She would brush Kappa when Everett asked, and she would bring him carrots sometimes, and he was always gentle with her, always patient. But there was a distance there that was neither unfriendly nor close. Like neighbors who wave but never quite have coffee together. That was fine. Kappa was Everett's until Everett wasn't there anymore. The diagnosis came in March of the year Leonora turned 70, pancreatic cancer. The doctor, a young man named Pelham, who spoke carefully and kept his hands very still on the desk, explained the staging in the kind of voice people use when they are trying to be both honest and kind at the same time, and finding it difficult to be either. Stage 4. Everett listened to the whole thing with his hat in his lap, nodding slowly like a man receiving directions to a place he wasn't in a hurry to go, but understood he'd have to reach eventually. He didn't cry until they got to the parking lot. Leonora held him beside the truck, her head against his chest, and they stood there in the September heat of a Texas afternoon and let it settle over them. The fact of it, the weight of it, until it became something they could carry, if not something they could accept. He had 7 months. They were, and she would say this later, more than once to anyone who asked, they were the most alive 7 months of her life. Not despite what was coming, because of it. Those 7 months had a texture to them that ordinary time doesn't have. Leonora felt it from the very beginning, a kind of luminous attention that settled over everything they did together. The way late afternoon light makes even ordinary things look painted. They ate breakfast together every morning at the kitchen table, something they'd always done but never noticed they were doing. They played cards after supper. They drove out to the lake on Sundays and sat on the tailgate and didn't feel the need to fill the quiet. And every single morning, without fail, Everett walked down to the corral. Even when the treatment made him nauseated, even when the weight was coming off him in ways that frightened her. Even in January, when the wind came down from the north like something with a grudge, he put on his coat and his hat, and he walked the 160 yards from the back porch to the fence, where Kappa was already waiting. Leonora watched from the kitchen window some mornings. She watched Everett put his hand flat against the horse's jaw, and she watched Kappa lean into it, not the polite tolerance of an animal accepting a touch, but the active leaning of a creature that wants contact. Needs it? She watched Everett do the 2-note whistle sometimes, even from 3 feet away, and she watched the horse's ears swivel forward like small satellites, locking onto a signal. She watched her husband talk to that horse. She couldn't hear the words, of course, but she could see the rhythm of it, the way Everett's mouth moved, the way he'd pause like he was listening to an answer, the way he'd sometimes laugh at something, just a short, quiet laugh, his breath visible in the cold air. She thought more than once, I don't know what they're saying to each other, but I'm grateful the horse is hearing it. Because Everett had always been a man who kept things interior, not cold, never cold, but private. He felt things very deeply and expressed them very selectively. With Leonora, he was open in ways he wasn't with anyone else. But even with her, there were rooms in him she sensed without entering. Places where the real weather of him lived, the complicated stuff, the fear and the longing and the things that don't have names. She suspected Kappa got all of that. She suspected the horse was the only one who got the unedited version. Toward the end of February, Everett's sister, a woman named Cressida, who drove down from Fort Worth and stayed 2 weeks, remarked on it one afternoon while she and Leonora were sitting on the porch. "He looks better when he comes back from that horse," Cressida said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Leonora said, "like it does something for him." "I think it does." Cressida was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think the horse knows?" Leonora looked out toward the corral, where Everett was leaning with both arms on the top rail, his hat pushed back on his head, Kappa standing close against the fence. "I think," Leonora said slowly, "that the horse knows things we don't." She wasn't sure she believed in that kind of thing. Animal intuition, animal grief, the idea that a creature without language could carry awareness of mortality like a stone in the chest. She wasn't sure. But she watched Kappa those weeks, and what she saw was something she filed away without a label, in the part of her mind where the unexplainable things go. Kappa became quieter. He stopped his usual movement around the paddock, the bored, habitual circuits he'd always done in the late morning. He stood near the gate. He stood and faced the house. He was watching for something. A neighbor, a man named Birchfield, who ran cattle about 2 miles east, and had known Everett for 30 years, stopped by one afternoon in March with a casserole from his wife. He leaned on the corral fence afterward, the way men in that country always do, not visiting, just standing nearby in a way that means friendship. He looked at Kappa for a long time. "That horse is worried," Birchfield said. Everett beside him said nothing, But he reached out and put his hand on Birchfield's arm briefly, and that was its own kind of answer. Everett died on a Saturday morning in late March. It was early, before sunrise, which meant the sky was still that deep specific blue that only exists for about 20 minutes and then is gone. Leonora was with him. Their daughter Ottoline, who'd driven down from Austin 3 days before when the hospice nurse named Reyes had gently suggested it might be time, was in the hallway. Their son Marsh had arrived the night before from Colorado, red-eyed and quiet, and was sitting in the kitchen when it happened. It was peaceful, the word people always use, and the word that is still somehow true. Leonora held his hand until it was no longer warm. Then she sat with him for a while in the silence of a room that had just fundamentally changed its nature. No longer a sick room, no longer a room where someone was fighting, just a room where someone had been and was no longer. Outside, in the grey pre-dawn, Kappa screamed. That is the only word for the sound. Not a whinny, not a nicker, a scream, high, raw, long. Leonora heard it from the bedroom. Ottoline heard it from the hallway and pressed her hand to her mouth. Marsh heard it from the kitchen and put down his coffee cup and stood very still. The sound came twice, and then it stopped. And then there was a new kind of silence, the kind that exists after a sound that shouldn't have been possible. None of them said anything about it right away. There were calls to make, arrangements to begin. The hospice nurse arrived. A neighbor, a woman named Dorothea, who had been Leonora's closest friend for 22 years, came within the hour. The house filled slowly with the careful machinery of loss. But Leonora kept thinking about that sound. 3 days later, after Ottoline and Marsh had gone back to their lives, carefully, reluctantly, with the guilty relief that adult children feel when they're allowed to leave grief and return to the world of the living, Leonora was alone in the house. She walked to the back window and looked down at the corral. Kappa was standing at the gate, just standing there, head up, looking toward the house. She felt something move through her, not grief exactly, or not only grief, something more complicated, the recognition that there were two of them now, herself and that horse, who had been left by the same man. She did not go down to the corral that day. She told herself she would soon. She told herself she just needed a little more time. But a week became 2 weeks, and 2 weeks became a month, and Dorothea's son, a young man named Kell, who had grown up around horses and offered to help, was coming by every day to feed and water and check on Kappa, and Leonora was grateful for that in a way that also, quietly, allowed her to stay away. Because here is what she was afraid of. She was afraid that going down there would be the same as going to the cemetery. She was afraid that Kappa in his horse body and his horse grief would be a mirror, that looking at him would show her something about the size of what had been lost that she wasn't ready to see yet. She had loved Everett for 44 years. She knew what she'd lost. She didn't need a horse to demonstrate it, or so she told herself. The months moved in the slow, peculiar way that months do when you are living alone for the first time in decades. Leonora had always been a capable woman, independent, practical, not given to the kind of helplessness that some women of her generation had been taught to perform. She managed the finances. She had always managed the finances. She cooked, she cleaned, she handled the small disasters of the house with the calm efficiency of someone who had been a functioning adult for 50 years. But living alone was different. Not harder in the practical sense, harder in a way that had no practical solution. The coffee was the right amount and still felt like too much. The television was too loud and then too quiet. She would start a sentence sometimes. Everett, have you seen? And the sentence would die in her mouth, and she would stand there in the kitchen with the unfinished words just hanging in the air of a room that didn't bounce them back. She saw a grief counselor, a composed, thoughtful woman named Diel, every 2 weeks at an office in town. She found it more useful than she expected. Diel didn't try to move her through grief on any schedule. She just listened and asked questions, and occasionally said things that were so precisely right they felt like keys turning in locks. "What are you protecting yourself from?" Diel asked her once, about 5 months after the funeral. Leonora had been talking about the Corral, about how she still hadn't gone back. "I'm not protecting myself," Leonora said. "I'm just not ready." Diel nodded. "Those can be the same thing." Leonora thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while she was driving home. She thought about it in the kitchen making supper. She thought about it the next morning when she looked out the window and saw Kappa standing near the gate, the same way he always stood now, still patient facing the house. She thought, what am I protecting myself from? And the honest answer, the one she didn't say out loud for another 2 months, was this. She was protecting herself from the possibility that the horse had moved on, that he'd adjusted, accepted, let go, that she would walk down there and he would look at her the way he always had, that polite, distanced, "You are not him" look, and that would be the proof that what Everett had with him was unrepeatable, unshared, gone with the man himself. She was afraid of finding that Kappa was just a horse now, because if the horse was just a horse, then maybe that was what she was too, just a woman now, without the particular gravity that a long love gives you, just orbiting nothing, the way a moon keeps circling long after the planet has gone cold. She knew this was not rational. She knew it in the way you know the things about yourself that counseling uncovers, intellectually, before you know it in your body. In August, 5 months after Everett died, her old friend from childhood, a woman named Celestine, who now lived in Albuquerque, came to stay for a week. They had known each other for 60 years, the kind of friendship where you can say the thing you haven't said to anyone else yet. One evening, sitting on the back porch, with the dry August heat finally softening at dusk, Celestine looked down at the Corral. "He's down there every time I look," she said. "He's always down there," Leonora said. "He's waiting," Celestine said, not like a question. "Kel says he's been like that since March." Celestine was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know, you're going to have to go down there eventually." "I know. Not because you owe it to the horse, because you owe it to yourself." Leonora didn't answer. "You're going to regret it," Celestine said gently, "if you never find out what he remembers." September came. October. The hill country does something beautiful in October. The cedar and the live oak and the Texas persimmon go through their own muted version of autumn. Not the blazing theater of the Northeast, but something quieter and more considered. Ochre and rust and the pale gold of dried grass. The sky goes very deep blue. The air smells like wood smoke from somewhere and juniper from everywhere. Leonora was not doing badly. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself mostly, because she sometimes felt guilty when she had a good day, as if good days were somehow disloyal. She was eating. She was sleeping most nights. She had started walking every morning, a habit she'd never had before, something Diel had suggested, and it was helping in ways she hadn't expected. The landscape calmed her, the physical act of moving through it, the fact that the world was still exactly itself. Kel continued coming by. She paid him a small amount. He'd tried to refuse it, and she'd told him she'd stop letting him help if he didn't take it, which was a bluff, but an effective one. He was a good young man, quiet and competent, and he kept Kappa in good condition. He reported to Leonora occasionally, not hovering, just giving her information. Kappa was eating well. His feet were good. He stood at the gate a lot. "Does he seem sad to you?" she asked Kel once. She was embarrassed to be asking. Kel considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't dismiss it. "He's different than he was before," Kel said. "Calmer, like he's settled into something. I don't know. Some horses get real agitated when they lose their person. He didn't. He just got quiet." "Is quiet better?" "I think quiet means he's still holding on to something," Kel said. "Agitated means they've given up. Quiet means they're still waiting." She thought about that for 2 weeks. On the first Tuesday of November, 14 months and 4 days after Everett died, Leonora put on her coat, pulled on her boots, and walked out the back door. She walked across the dry grass. The morning was cold and still, the sky pale and enormous the way it gets in November, the sun not yet fully up, everything existing in that blue-grey light that is not quite day. She could see the corral from the porch. She could see Kappa. He was not at the gate. He was standing in the far corner of the paddock, his back to her. She felt something drop in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the thing right next to it. The thing Diel would call anticipatory disappointment. She had come down here braced for something, and already the bracing was being dismantled in the wrong way. She walked to the fence. She put her hands on the top rail, cold wood, real wood, the same fence Everett had built and repaired and leaned on 10,000 times, and she stood there. For about 30 seconds, nothing happened. And then Kappa's ears moved. The ears rotated back, not all the way, not the alarmed backward press that means fear, but that slight backward swivel that means something has entered my awareness that I am trying to identify. He didn't turn his head. Leonora stood very still. She was aware of her own breathing. Shallow, too shallow. She was aware of the cold of the rail under her palms. She was aware that she was, in this moment, more frightened than she'd been in a long time, and that the thing she was frightened of was not danger, but significance, the possibility that this moment meant something, or the possibility that it didn't. Kappa turned his head. He turned it slowly, in the way horses do when they are not spooked but curious. The measured movement of an animal that is checking something out rather than reacting to it. He turned it until he could see her with his left eye, that large, dark eye with its long lashes, and he looked at her. She had been looked at by this horse before, many times. The polite, brief, "you are not him" look that she had always received and always accepted. This was not that look. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned his whole body, unhurried, deliberate, and faced her fully. He began to walk toward her. Not quickly, not the energetic trot he used to do when Everett's truck appeared on the drive, just walking, but walking with intention, there was no other word for it, with recognition, the way you walk towards someone you know when you've been waiting for them, and you're not surprised they've come, but you're glad, you're genuinely glad. Leonora put her hand over her mouth. She didn't know she was going to cry. She thought she was past the ambush crying, the kind that catches you without warning. She had cried so much in 14 months that she thought she had developed a kind of perimeter, some early warning system that would let her brace herself. No warning, just the tears. Kappa reached the fence. He stretched his neck over the top rail and put his nose forward, and Leonora, without thinking, moving by instinct or memory or something older than either, lifted her hand and let him put his nose into her palm. He exhaled. The breath was warm and long, and it moved across her hand and up her wrist, and she felt it the way you feel something that goes all the way down. He stood there with his nose in her hand and breathed, and she stood there holding his breath, and neither of them moved. She started talking. She hadn't planned to. The words came from the same place the tears had, not from her mind, but from somewhere below it. "He talked to you," she said. Her voice was rough. "All those years, I watched from the window, and I never knew what he was saying, but I knew it was the real stuff, the real him." Kappa's ear swiveled toward her, listening. "I was jealous sometimes," she said. "Isn't that something? Jealous of a horse." She laughed, and the laugh caught in her throat and came out wet. Not angry, jealous, just, "I wanted that too, the unedited version of him." She moved her hand up along the blaze on his face, that river-shaped blaze. He leaned into it, that active lean, the not tolerating but wanting. "Did he tell you he was scared?" she asked. "Because he never told me. He was so careful with me. He didn't want me to see the scared part." She wiped her face with her other hand. "I knew it was there, I knew. I never got to hold it for him. He didn't let me." Kappa was very still. His eye, that large dark eye, was looking at her, not past her, at her. "I think," she said slowly, "I think maybe he told you everything he couldn't tell me. And I think that means you were carrying it. After, when he was gone." She put both hands on his face, framing it the way she'd seen Everett do 1,000 times. "I'm sorry I left you alone with it," she said. "I'm sorry it took me so long." The horse pressed his forehead against her chest. He just put his forehead against her chest, the way a child does, the way a person does when they're exhausted and they've found the person they can finally stop being strong for. He pressed against her, and she put her arms around his neck, or as much of it as she could reach, and she held him there, this large, warm animal who had been standing at the gate and waiting for 14 months for someone to come. She didn't know how long she stood there, long enough for the sun to clear the tree line and come flat and gold across the grass, long enough for the cold to ease slightly, long enough for something in her chest, something that had been rigid and braced since March, to soften, not break, not dissolve, just soften, the way a fist opens when the danger has passed. And in that long, still moment, she understood something. Everett had not kept the real version of himself away from her. He had given her 44 years of himself, everything she was capable of holding, everything she had asked for. It was not that she had been given less. It was that Kappa had been given something specific, the fears a man won't speak aloud in the house he shares with someone he loves, the grief a man keeps in his hands and legs so it doesn't frighten the person sleeping next to him. He had given the horse the weight, so she could have the rest. She thought, that was a gift. That was also a gift. She stood at the fence in the November morning until Kappa finally lifted his head and stepped back, not pulling away, just releasing, and she looked at him, and she said, "I'll be back tomorrow." He looked at her. She said it again, quieter, "I'll be back tomorrow." She walked back to the house. She didn't look back, but she listened the whole way, and she didn't hear what she'd heard that March morning. No scream, no loss sound, just the ordinary sounds of the land. Birds, wind in the cedar, the world going about its business. She went back the next morning, and the morning after that. Kel kept coming. She was not trying to manage everything herself. She was not 20 years younger than she was, but she was there too, every morning for at least half an hour, sometimes longer. She started learning things she had never needed to know before, how to read Kappa's mood by his ears, by his stance, by the particular quality of his attention on any given morning, how to offer her hand low, not high, when approaching from the front, how to groom him, not the perfunctory brushing she'd done before, but the real systematic thing, starting at the neck and working back, the way Everett had done it, the way that makes a horse's eyes go soft and half-closed with something like pleasure. She called Otterline one evening and told her. Otterline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mum, that's really good." "I know it sounds strange," Leonora said. "It doesn't sound strange," Otterline said. "It sounds like Dad." She knew what her daughter meant. It sounded like the kind of thing Everett would have arranged, if he could have. The two of them meeting in the corral over the horse, finding each other there. He had always thought about the long game. He had always set things up to run after him. The fence he'd over-engineered so it would last 30 years. The bank accounts he'd organized so she'd never need to understand them, just read them. The horse he'd spent 11 years teaching a specific language, a two-note whistle, and a set of gestures and a daily presence that could not have been for himself alone. She thought sometimes that maybe it had been partly for her all along, partly for this, for after. Birchfield stopped by in December the way he always had, the way neighbors did out there, showing up without announcement because calling first would imply a formality that 30 years of proximity hadn't earned. He leaned on the corral fence and watched Leonora brush Kappa, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Everett would like this." "I think so too," she said. Birchfield nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Spring came, the way it always does in the hill country, arriving first as a loosening, a slight warmth in the air that isn't warm yet but isn't cold anymore either. The cedar turned soft at the edges. The bluebonnets came up along the fence lines and the road. Leonora was 72 now. She felt the difference in her knees and her lower back and the way her hands sometimes stiffened in the cold. But she felt other differences too, less quantifiable ones. The braced quality was gone. She would not have called herself healed, because she was not sure grief works that way, was not sure healing was the right word for something that was more like incorporation, like making a new organ to carry something that will always be there. She had the coffee in the morning, and the evening card game was now Scrabble against herself, which she knew was eccentric and didn't mind. She talked to Dial every 3 weeks instead of 2. That felt like a kind of graduation, though Dial had insisted on calling it a natural evolution. She talked to Ottoline and Marsh on Sundays. She had dinner with Dorothea twice a month, and every morning she walked down to the Corral. Kappa was always there, not always at the gate. He moved around now the way he used to, the bored morning circuits, the habitual grazing. He had resumed living in full, but when she came through the gate, he moved toward her, every time, without fail. She had looked up in an idle evening of reading, some things about horse memory. She'd found research suggesting horses could recognize a person by their voice, their scent, their gait for years, potentially for decades. They stored these recognitions somewhere deep, somewhere not available to language or theory. In the same place they stored fear and comfort and the sense of belonging to a particular place, a particular person. She had not told him he was hers now. She didn't know if that was something you told a horse or something that just became true through the accumulation of mornings. But she knew, by late April, that it had become true. She had been brushing him one morning, working along his flank, when it occurred to her that she was talking to him. She wasn't sure when it had started. She was telling him about Ottoline's news. She was expecting again, a second grandchild due in the fall, and Kappa's ear was turned toward her, and she was talking in the easy, unhurried way that she had watched Everett talk for years from the kitchen window, the unedited version. She stopped mid-sentence and laughed, a short, real laugh. "Well," she said to the horse, "look at that." He turned and looked at her with that large, dark eye. She put her hand on his face. He pressed into it. She thought about Everett. She let herself think about him the way she could now. Not with the sharp-edged thing that cuts if you lean against it wrong, but with the softer thing, the warm, heavy thing that is also called missing someone, and is also, strangely, a form of having them. She thought, he left me his horse. And then, more precisely, he left his horse me. There was a difference, and she felt it. Kappa was not a gift from Everett to Leonora. He was a point of arrival, a place where two separate kinds of love for the same man had met after the man was gone and recognized each other. She stood in the corral in the April morning with the blue bonnets along the fence and the sky doing what the hill country sky does and the horse's warm breath against her palm, and she understood that she was not done grieving, would never be entirely done grieving, but that she was also not only grieving, she was here. She was herself. She was someone who came to the corral every morning. That was enough. More than enough. Some stories are about closure. This isn't one of them. Leonora will tell you, and she does tell people now when they ask, that she didn't find closure at that fence. She found something better than closure. She found continuation. She found the place where love doesn't end but changes its form. The way water becomes vapor and is still water, just in a different way, just filling a different space. Everett is gone. That is permanent. That is true every morning when she wakes up and every night when the house is quiet. But she walks down to the corral, and the horse comes to meet her, and for a while, in the cold or the heat or the rain, in whatever the hill country decides to do on any given morning, she is not the widow of the man the horse loved. She is just someone he loves. That is everything. If this story reached something in you, if you know what it is to be left and to find your way back to something that was left too, leave a comment below. Tell me your city. Tell me what this meant to you. And if you have someone in your life right now who is still standing at their gate, still waiting, still facing the house, share this with them. Like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And until next time, take care of each other out there. The ones who are waiting deserve to be found.